It is the dead of winter. Outside, the land is entombed in frost, and the sky, thick with leaden clouds, presses down on a lifeless landscape. The fields are frozen, the forests skeletal. But it is not the wild countryside that suffers the most. No, in the great stone castles of medieval Europe, behind their walls of power and prestige, the cold reigns supreme. Contrary to modern imagination, castles were not cozy havens of crackling fires and roaring hearths. They were, in reality, vast, echoing chambers of cold stone and damp air. Fortresses first, homes second, they were built to repel armies, not winter. Defense was the goal, thick stone walls to withstand sieges, narrow slits for windows, lofty ceilings to prevent fire hazards. Warmth? That was a luxury, an afterthought in a world where survival often came first. And so, each winter, castle inhabitants braced themselves for months of bone-deep chill. Lords, ladies, knights, cooks, scullery maids, and scribes, all of them endured a cold that settled into their bones, one that no cloak or fire could truly banish. The problem was not just the lack of fire. It was the stone itself. Thick, unyielding stone walls held the cold like a memory. Even long after spring returned to the countryside, the interiors of castles remained icy and damp. The first bite of winter would usually come in November. The wind howled through arrow slits, crept through the seams of wooden doors, and sent its icy fingers beneath floorboards. Fires would be lit in the great hall, but the heat rarely traveled far. In chambers above and below, it was not uncommon to see frost forming along the inside walls, not outside but within. Breath steamed visibly in the air. Water left in a basin overnight might freeze solid. In such conditions, merely getting out of bed was an act of will. And yet, castles were not abandoned in winter. Life continued, cold or not. The business of rule, war, diplomacy, and daily survival trudged on. People adapted. The architecture, crude by our standards, still showed signs of clever design meant to combat the cold, and that is where our journey begins. But before we reach fireplaces and tapestries, we must first understand the medieval mindset. In the Middle Ages, cold was not necessarily seen as a problem to solve. It was a condition of life. Comfort was not expected. There were no thermostats, no wool socks waiting in drawers, no central heating humming quietly behind the walls. Instead, there was endurance, strength, suffering as a noble virtue. Even the noble class, with all their wealth, lived in conditions that today might be described as harshly ascetic. The great halls were large and drafty, their ceilings high to let smoke rise from open fires. These fires were sometimes ringed by a shallow stone hearth, and the smoke, instead of being funneled out by chimneys, would often linger, hanging heavy in the rafters before drifting out through a hole in the ceiling or cracks in the roof. Guests and residents alike coughed through dinners, eyes stinging from smoke, hands still chilled even in front of the flames. Windows were another enemy. Glass was rare and expensive, often reserved for the wealthiest churches or royal residences. In most castles, windows were covered with wooden shutters or waxed cloth, both poor insulators against the wind. During storms, snow could even blow into hallways. Rooms far from the central fire would drop to near outdoor temperatures, and so warmth became not a matter of comfort, but of proximity to the fire, to other bodies, to heavy layers of wool and fur. The medieval answer to the cold was not to heat the space, but to heat the person. This philosophy would shape castle design for centuries. Despite this, not all castles were equally frigid. Some, built in milder climates or designed with more foresight, fared better. Castles in southern France or Spain, for instance, with smaller courtyards and lower ceilings, trapped heat more effectively. Some even borrowed architectural ideas from Roman bathhouses and Islamic palaces, where heat management had been refined over centuries, but these were exceptions. For most of Europe, and especially in the cold northern regions, winter brought with it a siege of a different kind, a silent, creeping siege of frost. Daily life adjusted accordingly. Activity slowed. In many castles, only a handful of rooms would be actively used in the winter, often clustered around a single large hearth in the great hall or solar. The rest of the castle, storerooms, guest chambers, chapel, galleries, would remain dark and unheated. Echoing with silence and cold, people stayed put. Movement meant exposure. Servants scurried from one room to another wrapped in cloaks and furs, trying to finish their tasks before their fingers went numb. At night, warmth was a private battle. Bedchambers were not heated. Fires in bedrooms were rare due to the risk of smoke or sparks catching on tapestries. So people relied on feather beds, thick quilts, and the insulating properties of the canopy bed, a structure with curtains that could be drawn tightly to trap body heat. Even then, people sometimes went to bed with hot stones wrapped in cloth, or with small pans of coals slid under the mattress, a risky but sometimes necessary method to take the edge off the chill. Winter in a medieval castle was not romantic. It was survival. And yet, within this cold world, there were sparks of ingenuity, small victories in the war against the frost. The medieval mind, though resigned to discomfort, was not without invention. Over the next chapters, we will delve into these innovations, from tapestries and heated stones to architectural choices and the science of underfloor heating. But for now, imagine it. The year is 1284. Snow falls silently beyond the battlements. Inside, a nobleman pulls his cloak tighter, his breath a ghost in the air. Somewhere down below, a fire crackles in the great hall, its warmth swallowed by the stone. Above, in the bedchambers, servants light candles and tuck warm bricks into their lord's bed. The castle stands, proud, imposing, eternal, but within its mighty walls, the cold waits patiently. And winter has only just begun. The center of warmth in any medieval castle was not the sun-soaked courtyard or the drafty corridors, but the hearth, the large, often open fire that burned in the great hall. To understand how castles battled winter's grip, one must begin with this primitive but essential tool. The hearth was more than a source of heat. It was the heart of the household, literal and symbolic, glowing amid the gloom, the only spot where warmth wasn't a fleeting illusion. The great hall was the hub of daily life. Towering stone walls, often 2 stories tall, loomed around wooden trestle tables. A dais might hold a carved chair for the lord, while retainers, stewards, clerics, and guests took their places below. But all these gatherings, all this ceremony, orbited the fire. The hearth, often set into the middle of the floor, was a wide, low stone basin or patch of flattened earth where logs could be laid and fires built high. Some castles, especially by the 13th century, transitioned to wall-based hearths with hoods and vents, the early ancestors of the modern fireplace, but many remained stubbornly simple for centuries. Smoke did not neatly rise into a chimney. Instead, it meandered upward. Escaping through a hole in the high roof called a louver, or through whatever cracks time and craftsmanship had left in the beams, the design was crude, but effective within limits. The fire radiated heat in all directions, and for those seated or standing near it, it could be toasty, even stifling, but warmth diminished rapidly with distance. The back walls of the hall remained frigid, and cold air would seep in from the stone below and through the many nooks that the castle's solid defenses allowed. And yet there was magic in the hearth. It wasn't only warmth it provided, it was light in the long, dark winters. It was companionship. Around it, gossip stirred, songs rose, bread baked on stones, and nobles held councils deep into the night. Children played within its glow. Servants passed with tankards of ale. Dogs curled close to its embers. It was, in its way, the soul of the castle. Fueling these fires was no small task. Castles required a constant supply of firewood, and not just any wood. Green wood smoked terribly, so seasoned hardwood like oak or beech was preferred. Logs had to be felled, split, dried, and stored. A large castle might consume dozens of cartloads each week during the depths of winter. Managing firewood was a logistical feat, one that fell to reeves and stewards who planned year-round for winter stores. In forested regions, this was easier. In areas where trees were scarce, it became a costly burden. The fire itself was a living thing, tended by servants who woke before dawn and stayed up late to keep it alive. Ashes were shoveled out. Embers were banked overnight, covered to preserve heat. Fires were never allowed to go out if it could be helped. To let the hearth die was a shame, and worse, a cold fire meant a cold lord, and that meant consequences. But even in the presence of the fire, there was hierarchy. The lord and his family claimed the warmest seats. Retainers and honored guests might share the circle. Lower servants and messengers stood at the edge. Dogs and children lay near the ground, closer to the radiant heat. The further one was from power, the further one was from warmth. Heat, like everything else in the medieval world, was distributed by rank. Despite this, the hearth was inclusive in one way. It was often the only truly warm place in the entire castle. Bedrooms went unheated. Corridors were glacial. Kitchens had fire, yes, but were often detached or separate from the main structure to prevent catastrophic fires. Chapels were stone tombs of spiritual cold. So, when winter came, people gathered around the hearth not out of comfort, but necessity. For those seated far from the fire, tricks abounded. Furs, wool cloaks, and heavy mantles helped trap body heat. Foot warmers, small metal or ceramic boxes filled with embers, might be tucked beneath chairs. Some castle halls had rush mats or straw strewn on the floor, offering insulation against the icy stone beneath. Still, warmth faded quickly the moment one stepped away from the fire circle. As centuries passed, hearths evolved. By the late Middle Ages, chimney flues began to appear more frequently. These vertical channels, often built into the thickness of the wall, allowed smoke to escape more efficiently. This meant fires could be set against walls and rooms could finally be designed with specific heating in mind. Bedrooms, libraries, even chapels began to feature wall-mounted hearths. They were smaller than the great hall's blaze, but their heat, directed and more contained, made a world of difference. These were signs of progress, slow but steady. But even with innovation, the great hearth remained the symbolic heart of the castle. When visitors arrived in winter, it was to the great hall they were brought, to warm themselves before speaking their cause. During winter feasts, the hall roared with warmth and noise, the fire lending not only heat, but atmosphere, drama, and celebration. When plague or war kept households shut inside, it was the hearth that kept the world from turning to stone. And yet, for all its importance, the hearth was not a solution, only a center. Castles remained cold places. Fires burned hot and fast, and their warmth only stretched so far. Rooms beyond the hall remained locked in winter's hold. Those who sought warmth had to seek the fire itself. There was no illusion of central heating, no dream of consistent temperature. The medieval castle was a world of pockets, small zones of heat amid the cold, a hearth, a warm bed, a crowded room. Elsewhere the cold waited, but within those pockets life glowed. The fire, with all its smoke and ash, became the great defiance of winter. It hissed, it popped, it devoured logs like a starving beast. And so long as it burned, the people believed they could outlast the season. In the next part, we'll examine a different kind of warmth, not fire, but fabric. Thick wall hangings and towering tapestries, silent sentinels that stood against the winter chill. Not decorative alone, they were woven shields, stitched not just for beauty but for survival. The stone walls of a medieval castle were mighty. They deflected arrows, repelled raiders, and withstood the fury of siege engines. But there was one force they could never conquer, the creeping cold of winter. Stone was not just indifferent to warmth, it was an enemy of it. Cold seeped through the granite bones of the castle like ink through cloth, chilling the very air inside. And so medieval minds turned to an unexpected ally, fabric. Not just any fabric. Heavy, richly woven, layered, and enormous, tapestries, wall hangings, and fabric screens became quiet warriors in the endless battle against the freeze. To the untrained eye, these might seem purely decorative, intricate scenes of battle. Hunting, saints, or mythical beasts woven into walls. But they were far more than decoration, they were insulation. In a world without central heating, tapestries functioned like primitive thermal blankets for entire rooms. When winter crept in, walls were dressed like kings. The science was simple, though they didn't call it that. Stone absorbs cold and radiates it inward. A bare wall becomes a cold surface that chills the room from all sides. But cover that stone with thick fabric, especially wool or heavy linen, and suddenly a barrier is formed. The tapestry traps a thin layer of air between itself and the wall, acting as an insulator. It dulls the cold's reach. It breaks the echo of the wind. In castles across Europe, especially in the halls of the nobility, these textile shields became standard winter preparation. Great halls that echoed with drafty vastness were transformed, not into warm rooms necessarily, but into less cold ones. That distinction mattered. In a world of icy breath and numb fingers, a few degrees meant the difference between tolerable and torturous. The materials varied. Wool was most common, thick and coarse. Finer castles might use tapestries lined with silk or backed with linen. Fox, squirrel, ermine might be stitched into wall hangings for both prestige and insulation. Some even hung thick, padded leather for a more rugged masculine feel. But always, the goal was the same: to tame the walls. The process of hanging them was seasonal. In spring and summer, many of these tapestries were removed, cleaned, and stored in chests to prevent mold and fading from sunlight. But in the autumn, as the air turned crisp and the shadows lengthened, castle staff began the slow transformation. Hooks and pegs were set into walls. Ladders were fetched. Fabric was unfurled. The cold season was coming and the walls had to be armored. Tapestries weren't limited to great halls. Bedrooms, parlors, studies, and solars all received their layers of warmth. In chambers reserved for noblewomen, these hangings were often exquisitely detailed, scenes of gardens, lovers, or saints in radiant colors, but beneath the beauty was function. They dulled the winter chill and created a more human, intimate space. The presence of tapestries changed not just temperature but acoustics. Rooms grew quieter, cozier. The echo of stone softened. Voices became warmer. Shadows deepened. A room hung with tapestries was a different place entirely, less a fortress, more a home. Of course, such luxuries were not universal. Not every castle, and certainly not every room, was afforded these fabric shields. In lesser halls or in the cold corners of servant quarters, the stone remained bare. The lord's bedchamber might have wall hangings, but the grooms and cooks below had none. Warmth, like power, was unevenly distributed. For the wealthiest lords, tapestries also served as symbols of status. The larger and more elaborate the weaving, the more powerful the owner appeared. Some noble families commissioned entire cycles, sequences of tapestries telling stories across multiple panels. The famous Hunt of the Unicorn series, or The Lady and the Unicorn, were not only displays of wealth and artistry, but also of insulation. Giant, beautiful shields stitched against the weather. Some castles even used double layers. Behind the first decorative tapestry might hang a rougher, simpler cloth purely for insulation. Others used wooden panels behind tapestries to create air pockets. In especially frigid towers, leather curtains might be added beneath the fabric for an extra wind barrier. These innovations show that even in an age without thermometers or blueprints, the people understood their environment intimately. But the usefulness of wall hangings extended beyond insulation. They served as movable decor, important in an age when nobles frequently traveled between estates. A great tapestry could be rolled, packed, and taken to the next castle. Some noble families maintained inventories of their tapestries, like mobile heating units. Wherever the lord went, the warmth followed, or at least a layer against the cold. There were also curtains, not just for beds, but for alcoves, doorways, and window recesses. These thick draperies could be drawn close to block drafts or create smaller, warmer chambers within vast halls. Even stairwells and passageways might be hung with curtains in winter to prevent heat loss. Yet even these rich attempts had limits. Tapestries could not heat a room. They could only slow the cold, dull the edges, create an illusion of coziness. Still, in a world of few comforts, illusion mattered. When a knight returned from the bitter wind, his face stung red. And he stepped into a hall hung with thick woolen murals. The difference was more than symbolic. To the castle's residents, these hangings became part of the winter rhythm. Their presence meant the season had turned. The sun would ride lower, the halls would dim, fires would burn longer, and outside, the snow would fall silently on ramparts and towers, while inside, the walls bore forests, battles, angels, and beasts. woven from threads of wool, warmed by the glow of firelight. The castle remained cold, yes, but not as cold. Sometimes that was enough. Next, we leave the walls and look down toward the cold, hard floors. What lay beneath the feet of kings and cooks alike? In Part 4, we explore the use of rushes, straw, herbs, and reeds, the forgotten flooring that helped insulate and soften the chill from below. We rarely think of the floor beneath our feet. In the modern world, it is often carpeted, polished, or tiled, quiet, clean, and dependable. But in a medieval castle, the floor was no trivial surface. It was a battlefield in the war against the cold. And it was here, beneath the feet of lords and peasants alike, that one of the most enduring and overlooked defenses against winter was laid, the humble rush. Unlike today's insulated wooden planks or radiant heated tiles, the floors of medieval castles were often bare, hard stone. In some cases, they were packed dirt or rough masonry. Either way, they were frigid, unforgiving, and quick to suck warmth from anything: feet, furniture, even the very air. Cold crept upward from the earth like a ghost, especially in basements or lower chambers built partially below ground level. To fight this, medieval inhabitants turned to nature: rushes, reeds, hay, straw, herbs, and moss. These were gathered, dried, bundled, and laid in thick mats across the floor, a medieval carpeting system of sorts. Known collectively as floor rushes or simply rushes, they formed a soft, organic layer that served several purposes, but chief among them was insulation. The principle was simple. The rushes trapped pockets of air between their stalks, creating a barrier between the icy stone and the occupants of the room. They cushioned each step and added warmth underfoot, especially important in a world where shoes were thin, and going barefoot indoors was not uncommon among servants and children. In the great halls of castles, fresh rushes were often laid seasonally. The practice was part of the castle's winterizing ritual. Come autumn, servants would gather fresh bundles from nearby rivers and marshes, often sweet flag or common rushes, and bring them in to be dried, cut, and arranged. The cleanest bundles were used in the more prestigious chambers, the Great Hall, the Lord Solar, the family's bedchambers. Coarser materials were saved for kitchens, storerooms, and servant quarters, but rushes did more than warm. They absorbed spills, they muffled footsteps, they covered stains and imperfections in the stone. In time, layers would build up, the fresh laid atop the old, until the rushes were several inches thick. Into these layers people scattered fragrant herbs: lavender, thyme, rosemary, and chamomile. These were not just for scent, though that was welcome in a world with few baths and many animals. The herbs helped repel fleas, lice, and vermin. Still, the reality was messier than the romantic image might suggest. Over time, the lower layers of rushes became filthy, soaked with spilled wine, trampled food, ash from the hearth, bits of dropped bone, and worse. Dogs, children, and rodents made their home in it. In some castles, the rushes were changed only once or twice a year. The accumulation became an entire ecosystem, pungent, alive, and sometimes dangerously flammable. There were criticisms, even in their own time. Erasmus, writing in the 16th century, lamented the English habit of layering new rushes over old, allowing filth to fester underneath. The floor, too, is usually of clay, strewed with rushes, he wrote, under which lie unmolested an ancient collection of beer, grease, fragments, bones, spittle, excrement of dogs and cats, and everything that is nasty. But practicality often outweighed hygiene. In the freezing months of winter, comfort took precedence, and so the rushes remained. The practice wasn't uniform. In some wealthier castles, especially those built later in the Middle Ages, more permanent flooring solutions were introduced. Wooden planks, for example, raised slightly from the stone below, allowing some circulation and warmth. But even in these cases, rushes might still be spread across the floor during winter, especially in high traffic or particularly drafty areas. In certain rooms, rushes were arranged with remarkable care. In royal or noble households, rushes might be cut short and combed flat, almost like a woven mat. They could be arranged in decorative patterns interspersed with herbs and petals. There are accounts of feasts held over elaborately prepared rush-covered floors, softening the impact of cold on guests' feet and reducing the echo in grand halls. Rush mats also served a mobile function. In bedchambers or smaller sitting rooms, they could be rolled and moved as needed. Some were stitched together to create rudimentary rugs, while others were piled thick at entryways to soak up the cold air slipping beneath the doors. And speaking of doors, thresholds and gaps were another source of chill. Heavy rushes were sometimes piled against door bases to block drafts, forming primitive door snakes. Every inch of a castle's surface, wall, window, floor, and door was a weak point in winter. The rushes were the easiest, most flexible defense. Not all castles had access to the same materials. In mountainous or forested regions, straw or moss might be used instead of river rushes. In coastal areas, even seaweed was occasionally dried and layered beneath reeds. The point was not purity, but insulation. Whatever worked, whatever was available. Though largely forgotten today, the sound and feel of rushes would have been part of daily life in a medieval castle. The soft rustle underfoot, the faint herbal scent, the earthy scratch of stalks on bare solace. In a world of hard edges and harder winters, they were a touch of softness, a reminder that warmth could be coaxed from even the humblest things, but rushes, like all things, had their limits. They didn't provide true heat, only a buffer. If the fire died or the wind howled through the halls, the rushes could do nothing but muffle the cold's laughter. Yet for centuries they remained, trampled, replaced, replenished, a quiet, persistent answer to the chill rising from below. In the next part, we turn our gaze upward to another key innovation, the development of fireplaces, flues, and chimneys, and how medieval minds began to learn not just to make heat, but to manage it. It is difficult to imagine now, but the fireplace, that seemingly ancient symbol of domestic warmth, was once a radical innovation. In the earliest centuries of castle construction, there were no cozy hearths nestled into the walls, no gentle flues pulling smoke skyward. Instead, there were open fires in the middle of rooms, the smoke curling freely into the air, stinging the eyes, blackening rafters, and staining stone ceilings. The hearth was the heart of the home, yes, but one that smothered as much as it warmed. The invention and spread of the fireplace marked a turning point not just in architecture, but in comfort. It allowed heat to be more efficiently directed, rooms to be more effectively warmed, and for the first time, people could breathe easily without coughing on smoke. But this evolution was slow, uneven, and surprisingly late. In the earliest castles, dating from the Norman and early Plantagenet periods, fires were often built in simple central hearths, pits or raised stones in the middle of the great hall. The smoke was left to find its own way out, drifting upward toward a hole in the roof called a louver. These openings were rudimentary at best, and during heavy wind or rain, they let in more than they let out. Still, this design persisted for generations. Then, slowly, something changed. Builders began to experiment. Fires were moved from the center of the room to the walls. Stone-lined fireboxes were created, often with crude hoods to catch the smoke and direct it upward. These were the earliest true fireplaces, and they made possible the next great leap, the chimney. The chimney was not at first a common sight. In fact, for many years it was considered a luxury, an expensive and complex feature that only the wealthiest lords could afford to incorporate into their towers. But those who had them quickly saw the benefits. A chimney created a controlled vertical path for smoke, drawing it efficiently away from the room and out of the building. This meant cleaner air, yes, but more importantly, it meant the fire could burn hotter. When smoke is trapped, it stifles the flame. When it is vented upward through a narrow flue, oxygen feeds the fire more freely, allowing a stronger, more consistent burn. This made rooms warmer, fires more efficient, and wood supplies stretch further. It was nothing short of a revolution in medieval heating. By the 13th and 14th centuries, chimneys began to spread. They first appeared in royal castles and ecclesiastical buildings, then in manors and merchant homes. Each fireplace had its own chimney, and this required careful planning. The flue had to be angled or lined so that it could ascend through thick stone walls or towers without weakening the structure. Some castles retrofitted existing rooms to include chimneys, carving flues into walls as best they could. Others simply built new wings around the innovation. Fireplaces, once central to one large hall, now appeared in private chambers. For the first time, lords and ladies could have personal warmth, a fire of their own, lit by servants glowing through the night. Bedchambers became more than just places of sleep. They became refuges from the cold. In some castles, even chapels and libraries gained their own hearths. Heat, no longer confined to the Great Hall, began to spread through the fortress, unevenly, yes, but meaningfully. And with the arrival of the fireplace came 1,000 small adaptations. Mantles were added, first to catch smoke and later to display status. Hearths were raised to be more comfortable. Firebacks, often made of iron, were installed to reflect heat back into the room. Grates and andirons improved airflow and supported logs. Ash collection became routine. The entire ritual of tending fire became more refined. But these improvements did not solve all problems. Early chimneys were prone to downdrafts, especially during storms. Poorly built flues could smoke terribly. And chimney fires were a real danger, especially when soot built up in narrow, crooked channels. In castles made of wood and thatch, a single spark could spell disaster. So chimneys had to be cleaned, often by children or thin servants sent up into the flue with brushes, the medieval forerunners of the chimney sweep. Moreover, even with fireplaces, warmth remained localized. A blazing fire could heat the immediate area, but in a room with 30-foot ceilings and thick stone walls, that heat had limits. Walk just a few paces from the hearth and the cold returned. The walls remained cold, the air near the floor stayed chilled. The heat was real, but it was stubbornly confined. In some cases, fireplaces were installed back-to-back, one on each side of a wall, heating 2 rooms with a single flue. In larger castles, clusters of chimneys sprouted from the rooftops, each signaling a hearth within. These chimneys became a sign not only of innovation but of status. To have multiple fireplaces was to have mastery over winter, a boast, a comfort, and a practical triumph. As castle design evolved in the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the inclusion of fireplaces became standard. New castles were designed with them from the ground up. They were placed not only in great halls and bedrooms, but in guardrooms, towers, and even kitchens. These changes marked a shift in how medieval people thought about warmth. No longer was fire simply a central blaze for all to gather around. It became personalized. Rooms could be heated individually. Privacy and warmth were no longer mutually exclusive. Yet still, limitations remained. No amount of stonework or chimney design could turn a castle into a truly warm place, not in the depths of winter. The fireplace was a step forward, not a solution. But it was a powerful one, and it forever altered the way people lived, built, and endured the cold. Next, we explore a heating method far older and, in some cases, surprisingly advanced, one that harks back to the Roman Empire. Could the secret to warm floors in medieval castles have been borrowed from the ancients? In Part 6, we examine the curious and rare phenomenon of underfloor heating in a world of ice and stone. Beneath the cold stone slabs of medieval castles, hidden away from the eyes of lords and peasants alike, a whisper of the ancient world lingered, a whisper of warm floors, heated rooms, and rising comfort. It was a remnant of Roman genius, a marvel of early engineering that, while rare, never entirely vanished. Underfloor heating, the hypocaust, was not a medieval invention, but in isolated corners of the medieval world it flickered back to life. To understand how underfloor heating appeared in the Middle Ages, one must travel back centuries earlier. The Roman hypocaust system was a marvel of thermal logic. It worked by raising the floor on a network of small pillars, leaving a crawl space beneath. Into this space, hot air and smoke from a nearby furnace would be channeled, heating the floor from below. Flues in the walls allowed the hot air to rise and escape, warming the entire room efficiently and silently. It was elegant, clever, and astonishingly effective. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, many of these technologies fell into disuse. The hypocaust, requiring skilled labor, frequent maintenance, and reliable fuel supplies, became increasingly impractical in a fractured and chaotic Europe. Castles were being built with defense in mind, not comfort. Fireplaces and hearths were simpler and more adaptable. So the warm floors of Rome faded into memory, but memory is not erasure. And the knowledge was never entirely lost. In certain parts of Europe, especially where Roman ruins remained intact, the concept of the hypocaust lingered. Some monasteries, particularly those built near ancient Roman sites, reused the ruins of Roman bathhouses or villas, restoring and adapting their heating systems. Monks were often among the most educated men of the Middle Ages, and their scriptoriums preserved ancient texts that described Roman engineering. In the cold stone cloisters of a northern monastery, the idea of warm floors was not a myth, it was a legacy. There are scattered examples of medieval buildings incorporating basic forms of underfloor heating, though they were exceptional, not common. One of the most notable examples was the palace complex of the Archbishop of York at Cawood Castle, where 14th century records describe a warming room with heated floors. In Germany and Poland, archaeological remains show adaptations of the Roman method in monastic and noble buildings. In Korea, a similar system called ondol was in use, and in Islamic Spain, the hammam retained heated floors throughout the medieval period. The medieval adaptation of underfloor heating often came with compromises. It was rarely as sophisticated as its Roman predecessor. The floors might be raised slightly and heated with smoke from a kitchen or furnace. In some cases, a servant was stationed below the floor to stoke fires and monitor the vents. These systems were not widespread, expensive to build, and notoriously inefficient unless carefully managed. But they represented a quiet persistence of ancient knowledge in a colder, rougher age. In castles where such systems existed, they were reserved for the most important rooms, the bathhouse, the private chamber of a lord or bishop, or the warming rooms of monasteries. These were not large areas. Underfloor heating was simply too costly to be used broadly. And yet in those rare chambers, the effect must have felt miraculous. Imagine stepping into a stone chamber in the dead of winter. The air outside bites with frost. The corridors echo with wind. But here, in this single room, the floor is warm beneath your feet. No visible fire burns. No smoke chokes the air. And yet, heat radiates upward, quiet and persistent, as though the earth itself had begun to thaw. For servants and stokers, however, the story was less romantic. Working beneath the floor was hot, smoky, and dangerous. The fires had to be kept alive with constant feeding. The flues had to be cleared of soot. And ventilation was key. Without proper airflow, the system could backfire, filling the building with smoke or even causing suffocation. Still, it was a price many lords were willing to pay for one heated room in an otherwise frozen world. The concept of heated floors did not spread widely in Western Europe during the medieval period. But in Eastern Europe, parts of the Middle East, and North Africa, similar systems thrived. In the Islamic world, the tradition of the heated bathhouse or hammam preserved and advanced Roman technology. These structures often included heated floors and walls, powered by centralized furnaces, and were available to the public as well as the elite. Here, heat was not just a comfort, but a ritual. In contrast, medieval Europe remained focused on open fires and insulation. Castle walls grew thicker, fireplaces improved. But underfloor heating remained a whisper, a flicker of ancient brilliance, remembered in certain scholarly circles and reawakened only rarely, like a dream of Rome rising through the floor. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, architectural sophistication returned. Classical texts were rediscovered. Engineers and architects began to study the old ways anew. The hypocaust was not revived wholesale, but its principles were revisited. Ideas like air circulation, radiant heating, and architectural insulation began to gain traction. Slowly, warmth became not just a fire, but a strategy. Today, archaeologists uncover traces of these forgotten systems beneath monasteries and manor houses, blackened stones, raised flooring, channels carved in ancient masonry. Each discovery is a quiet testament to a time when even in the midst of feudal hardship, people still looked down at the cold floor and asked, "Can this be made warm?" The answer sometimes was yes. In the next part, we rise from the floors and turn to another crucial frontier in the battle against winter, the windows. How did medieval architects keep out the biting wind without glass? What role did shutters, skins, and clever design play in holding warmth within the walls? Find out in Part 7, Windows, Glass, and the Battle Against the Breeze. The wind is the oldest enemy of warmth. It finds cracks, creeps through gaps, and howls like a banshee through any space not sealed tight. In the stone labyrinths of medieval castles, windows were a necessary vulnerability, slits for defense, openings for light, and unfortunately, portals for cold. They were the eyes of the fortress, and in winter they wept with frost. Today, we take windows for granted. Glass, double-glazed and sealed, is everywhere, a transparent wall that blocks the elements while letting light pour in. But in a medieval castle, glass was an unimaginable luxury. Most windows were open holes in the wall, sometimes narrow for archers, sometimes broad for light, but always vulnerable. In the depth of winter, it wasn't just the cold that came in, but the wind, the snow, the rain, the sound of wolves, the smoke from the chimneys below. So how did people keep warm with such gaping mouths in their walls? The answer, as always in the Middle Ages, was a blend of ingenuity, compromise, and hierarchy. Let us begin with the simplest solution, shutters. These were thick wooden panels, hinged or slotted into place over window openings. Closed at night or during storms, they helped to block drafts and keep out the worst of the weather. But wood alone was not airtight. The gaps between planks could leak air, and in castles that swelled and shrank with the seasons, no seal remained perfect for long. Still, they were far better than nothing, and in many rooms they remained the only defense. In more refined chambers, these shutters were lined with leather or wool to provide a tighter seal. Some shutters were built into the stone, set within deep window recesses that added layers of defense. During winter, these alcoves were often curtained from within, not with delicate gauze, but with thick drapes of wool, fur, or waxed linen, tied back during the day and let down at dusk to create another thermal barrier. In truly elite homes, palaces, cathedrals, and royal castles, glass became a coveted prize, but not glass as we know it. Medieval window glass was thick, cloudy, bubbled, and often poured in small sections. Sheets were rare and expensive to make. Most castle windows that featured glass used tiny circular panes called bullions, made by spinning molten glass into discs. These would then be set in lid frames to form small windows. The resulting surface was uneven, distorted, and poor at insulating, but it was a window nonetheless. It let light in while keeping the wind out, at least partially. Some medieval glaziers experimented with oiling cloth or parchment to create translucent window coverings. These could be stretched across a frame, offering a hazy glow in daylight while reducing drafts. Others used horn, flattened, scraped, and polished to allow in light. Animal horn was surprisingly versatile in this regard. It bent rather than shattered, resisted moisture, and was more available than glass. But it offered only a dim and yellowish view of the outside world. In households wealthy enough to afford actual glass, it was often reserved for the chapel or the Lord Hess Solar, the private upper chamber where the family lived and worked. These windows were small and thick, often set high in the walls to preserve heat. Glass was valuable, and in some cases, windows were unglazed in summer and only fitted with glass panels during the winter months. But even the best medieval windows failed to keep out all the cold. Deep-set walls could form miniature wind tunnels. Stone, chilled by snow and shadow, conducted cold right to the frame. Water could condense and freeze on the inside. Ice formed on sills and shutters alike. In some castles, it was common to find frost rimming the interior of a window even as the fire blazed a few feet away. This is why heavy drapery became essential. Windows were almost always dressed, not for beauty, but for warmth. Curtains were tied tightly across the frame at night, sometimes double-layered, sometimes fur-lined, in large halls or galleries. Entire rows of windows might be covered with wooden screens or tapestry-wrapped panels during winter. These efforts were part of the great seasonal shift, the closing in of the castle as the cold deepened. Window placement also mattered. In earlier castles, windows were few and far between narrow arrow slits more suited for defense than light. These slits were less vulnerable to the cold but let in little sunlight, which meant rooms remained dark and chilly. As architecture evolved, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, larger windows were introduced in more private rooms. These were often fitted with multiple panes, deep mullions, and even stained glass in places of wealth. Though beautiful, these additions came with a cost. More glass meant more vulnerability to the cold. The battle against the breeze extended beyond glass. Builders positioned windows to minimize exposure to prevailing winds. In colder regions, north-facing windows were smaller or eliminated entirely. Stone arches and deep casements were designed to protect the window's frame from snow and rain. In some places, thick wooden transoms or sliding panels could be drawn across the inside of a window recess to further block the cold. And still, in winter, the wind always found a way in. Servants and guards, whose quarters were often located in towers or outer walls, had the worst of it. Their windows were rarely glazed, rarely shuttered well, and rarely curtained. A thin wool blanket might be all that stood between a guard and the night air howling through a slit in the stone. Many slept with cloaks over their heads. Some nailed animal skins across windows. Others simply endured. The higher one rose in status, the warmer one's windows became. But even kings had to contend with frozen panes, whistling drafts, and frost creeping across the glass like fingers. Castles were not airtight. They were not modern. They were defiant stone structures built for war first, comfort second. And their windows, so necessary, so dangerous, were always the weak spot. Yet, even in this vulnerability, there was invention. The medieval world never stopped seeking small victories against the cold. And in every closed shutter, every oiled cloth stretched across a frame, every fur-lined curtain drawn tight at dusk, we see the same quiet plea: keep the warmth in, keep the winter out. Next, we move from architecture to the personal, from rooms to beds. How did people stay warm when the fire was out and the night was long? In Part 8, we climb into the medieval bedchamber and examine the strange, ingenious world of canopy beds, curtains, and nighttime warmth. When the fires burned low and the torches dimmed, there remained one final bastion of warmth in the cold stone silence of a medieval castle: the bed. More than a place to sleep, it was a cocoon, a chamber within a chamber, a defensive outpost against the nightly siege of frost and draft. In a world where central heating did not exist and where rooms often hovered just above freezing, the medieval bed was a marvel of layering, ingenuity, and hierarchy. The castle bedchamber, known as the solar for those of high status, was one of the few truly private spaces in a fortress. Typically located in the upper stories of the keep or great hall, it offered not just distance from the cold ground, but symbolic elevation. Warmth was, quite literally, a privilege. These upper rooms received more sun, less moisture, and less contact with the damp stone below. But they were not warm by default, and so the bed had to do the work. Let us begin with the centerpiece of warmth, the canopy bed. Far from a decorative flourish, the canopy was a necessity, a tented roof that trapped body heat and blocked the cold descending from the ceiling above. Curtains draped from all sides, heavy and thick, often lined with wool or fur. At night, these curtains were drawn tight, transforming the bed into a private, insulated chamber within the chamber. Inside, the breath of two sleepers could raise the temperature noticeably, a human furnace burning all night. The bed itself was large, often made of heavy oak or walnut, with raised platforms to avoid the coldest air near the floor. The mattress was a feat of its own, usually a cloth sack stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers. Wealthier families used feather beds layered atop firmer straw pallets. These were fluffed and turned regularly, a duty assigned to servants. Above the mattress came the bedding, sheets of linen or hemp, followed by several layers of blankets. The finest blankets were woven of wool and trimmed in fur. The heaviest might be quilted or filled with down, and atop it all, the coverlet or bedspread, thick, decorative, and warm. In noble homes, these were often embroidered or adorned with family crests. In winter, pelts of fox, bear, or wolf might be laid across the top for added insulation. At the foot of the bed, warm stones or metal pans filled with embers were slipped beneath the covers to preheat the space, a practice not without risk as some beds caught fire in the process. But warmth was more than fabric and fire, it was strategy. Medieval people knew how to sleep in layers. Even indoors, a sleeper might wear a nightcap, gloves, socks, and a thick shift or nightgown. Children were bundled tight, swaddled in wool or fur-lined cloth. And it was not uncommon for 2 or more people to share a bed, not for affection but for heat. Body warmth was a resource too valuable to waste. In many castles, the lord and lady would share a bed not only with each other, but with small children, favored companions, or pets. Dogs, especially, were considered efficient bed warmers, loyal, quiet, and radiating heat. Cats, too, found their way beneath blankets. In lower quarters, servants and guards sometimes slept 3 or 4 to a bed, packed like kindling for mutual warmth. Servants would often enter the bedchamber before nightfall to close the shutters, draw the curtains, and stoke the fire if one existed. They might warm the sheets with heated bricks wrapped in cloth or pans filled with coals, sliding them between the covers just before their master retired. The smell of scorched linen and warm iron was the smell of medieval comfort, but not all beds were equal. While the nobility slept beneath carved wooden canopies and velvet drapes, the lower ranks did what they could. A servant's bed might be a straw mat on the floor, perhaps with a rough wool blanket and a spare cloak. In particularly harsh winters, servants might sleep in the kitchens near the last embers of the cooking fire. Others nested in alcoves, stairwells, or wherever stone gave way to shadow. For them, warmth came from ingenuity, layering every garment they owned, curling into tight shapes, sharing blankets, burning tallow if allowed. Even in noble rooms, there were limits. Castles were not well sealed. Cold air still crept beneath doors and through window frames. The stone walls themselves radiated chill. In harsh winters, frost could form inside a room, even on a bedpost. It was not uncommon to wake with stiff fingers, even after sleeping under 6 layers of wool. Breath hung in the air like mist. The comfort of a warm bed was real, but temporary. Morning meant facing the cold again. Some castles employed personal braziers, portable metal baskets filled with hot coals, to warm specific corners of a room. These were set near the bed or chair and could be moved by servants. The smoke, if not properly vented, could suffocate, but for many, the risk was worth the heat. Chimneys were rare until the later Middle Ages, and even then, their draftiness often stole more heat than they preserved. A room with a fireplace was a luxury, a bed with its own brazier, a blessing. Interestingly, sleep itself was different in the medieval world. It came in 2 parts, first sleep and second sleep, separated by a quiet waking hour in the middle of the night. During this interval, people might pray, tend the fire, or simply lie in bed and talk. In the dead of winter, this middle period became a time to feed the brazier, adjust the curtains, or add more fuel to the bed warmer. Warmth was not a one-time effort. It was a continual negotiation with the cold. And when one awoke, the shock of morning was brutal. Rising from the bed meant parting the curtains, exposing oneself to the bitter air of the room, stepping barefoot onto icy stone. Clothes, often cold and damp, had to be pulled on in haste. Fingers fumbled with ties and laces. The warmth of sleep vanished like breath in the wind. In the end, the medieval bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a tool of survival, a fortress within a fortress. A carefully managed microclimate surrounded by a world of chill. And in its furs, feathers, and flickering shadows, it offered one of the few true comforts of medieval life. But while the lord warmed himself in bed, the castle kitchen below roared to life. Next, we descend into the great hearth, where boiling cauldrons, roasting spits, and smoldering embers served not just food, but heat. Join me in Part 9, warming stones, hand warmers, and heated pans, where warmth became portable. Clever and sometimes life-saving, warmth in a medieval castle was never taken for granted. It had to be summoned, captured, and carried. Stone walls hoarded the cold like secrets, and fires, no matter how grand, could only do so much. But even in this world of drafty corridors and icy stone, the people of the Middle Ages were never short of invention. When large fires weren't enough or couldn't be moved, warmth had to become portable. And so they created tools of heat, warming stones, hand warmers, heated pans. Primitive perhaps, but clever and often essential to survival. Let us begin with the warming stone, a simple, almost elegant solution. A large stone, typically flat and dense, would be placed in or near a fire until it was radiating heat. Then, using tongs or wrapped cloth, the stone would be removed and transferred to another location, often a bed, a seat, or a footstool. Set beneath blankets or cushions, it would emit a gentle, lasting warmth. The heavier the stone, the longer the heat endured. In a noble bedchamber, a servant might preheat the bed with one or more warming stones, wrapped in cloth to avoid burning the linens. The method was ancient, with Roman origins, and it endured for centuries. Some stones were even kept in specially carved boxes or iron holders, allowing them to be moved without risk. But the technique had its drawbacks. Stones took time to heat and longer to cool, and they were heavy. Even so, in a world where comfort was fleeting, they were worth their weight. More advanced and more portable were heated pans. These were often shallow metal trays with lids and long handles, designed to be filled with glowing embers or hot coals from a hearth. Once full, they could be placed beneath a bed's covers or moved from room to room. The most common use? Warming the sheets before sleep. These bed warmers were typically made of brass or copper metals that conducted heat efficiently. The embers inside provided steady warmth, while the metal casing kept direct flame away from fabric. But this was not without danger. Too long in one place, and the heat could scorch the bedding. Stories abound of linens catching fire or wooden bed frames smoldering during the night. It was a risk, but one most were willing to take in the dead of winter. In more humble homes, similar devices were improvised. Iron pots or pans filled with coals served the same purpose. Some families heated bricks or clay tiles and wrapped them in cloth to place at their feet. The poor often slept with small animals, dogs, even chickens, to supplement the warmth. The idea of keeping heat became a kind of philosophy in the Middle Ages. Fire was a blessing, but it had to be managed wisely. Too little, and you froze. Too much, and you risked smoke, suffocation, or flames. Thus, a whole class of small heat-retaining devices evolved. Subtle, often personal, such as hand warmers and foot stoves. Hand warmers were small, sometimes ornate, boxes of metal or ceramic, filled with coals or warmed stones. Carried in cloaks or kept near work tables, they allowed nobility to write, read, or pray without losing feeling in their fingers. Some were as simple as pottery bowls held in laps. Others were intricately designed with air holes and carved handles, used by clergy, scribes, or noblewomen during long, frigid services in drafty chapels. Foot stoves, wooden boxes with slatted tops, served a similar purpose. A small brazier or hot stone inside the box would warm a seated person's feet, particularly during meals, prayers, or sleep. In churches and castles alike, these boxes became part of winter life. One could sit in a stone pew or at a cold wooden table with frozen fingers, but at least the feet could be warm. Some even placed foot stoves inside wagons or sleighs during winter travel. For long journeys through snow-covered forests or icy plains, the difference between comfort and frostbite was measured in the contents of a wooden box. In castles, the use of warming pans and foot stoves extended into daily routines. Ladies-in-waiting would bring hand warmers to their mistresses while they dressed. Pages might slip warm tiles beneath the benches of the great hall. A knight might prepare for morning training by warming his boots over a fire-heated brick. Warmth also traveled in more curious ways. Heated cloths, flannel, or linen warmed by fire were laid on shoulders or necks to relieve cold-induced stiffness. Furs were sometimes hung near the hearth before being worn outdoors, absorbing precious heat. In the kitchens, cooks and scullions carried their own improvised warmers to survive the hours spent on icy stone floors. Yet all of these methods had their limitations. Heat dissipated quickly. Stones cooled, coals dimmed, and pans lost their warmth. It was a constant struggle, not to heat a whole room, but to warm a space just large enough to live in. In the vast expanse of a medieval castle, with its soaring ceilings and yawning halls, that space might be no bigger than the bed, the chair, or the hearthside bench. One of the most telling signs of medieval winter life was how small people made themselves, curled, wrapped, bundled. Warmth was proximity, to fire, to stone, to one another. The tools of warmth were not grand inventions, but quiet, clever companions, small enough to be carried, simple enough to be made by hand, but powerful enough to guard against the cold. And so we find in these devices a deeper truth about medieval life. To be warm was not merely to be comfortable. It was to be safe, alive, human. In every heated stone, every glowing pan slipped under a bed, every coal carried in a ceramic box, we see a battle fought, not against dragons or invading armies, but against the biting, unrelenting cold. But warmth was also found in something more ordinary: food. The kitchen was a furnace of its own, the heart of the household. In the next part, we enter that space of fire and steam, where the heat of cooking became one of the few reliable sources of comfort for all. Part 10. Clothing indoors, the layers never came off, follows next, as we explore how medieval fashion was not about style, but survival. It is easy to imagine a medieval lord striding through his great hall in gleaming armor, or a lady floating down a corridor in silk and lace. But these are illusions, portraits painted by wealth, ceremony, and fiction. The reality of castle life in winter was colder, heavier, and much more layered. When the walls were stone and the wind crept in like a thief. The first and most constant defense against the chill was not the hearth, it was clothing. To live in a medieval castle during winter meant wrapping oneself in warmth from morning until night, and often through the night as well. Clothing was not changed casually or cleaned often. In the coldest months, garments were rarely removed at all. They were layered like armor, soft and heavy, practical and persistent, and each layer served its purpose. Start at the skin. The first layer was typically a linen chemise or undershirt, simple, breathable, and relatively soft. Linen was not especially warm, but it absorbed sweat and kept the outer layers clean. Over that came wool, always wool. The working fabric of medieval Europe. Wool tunics, dresses, and hose formed the foundation of winter wear. Wool had memory. It could hold its shape, trap air, and resist water. More importantly, it kept its insulating power even when damp. A well-woven woolen tunic could retain body heat for hours. The rich could afford finer weaves. The poor made do with rougher, scratchier cloth. Either way, wool was king. For men, this meant a tunic over their linen, perhaps two. Hose or leggings covered the legs, fastened with laces or belts. A surcoat or cloak went over all, thick, heavy, sometimes lined with fur. Ladies dressed similarly in layers: linen chemise, woolen kirtle or gown, and over that a mantle or cloak. A well-dressed woman in winter was often swathed in over 15 pounds of fabric. Gloves and mittens were essential, even indoors. So, too, were thick woolen socks or foot wraps. Shoes, while often simple, might be lined with fur or stuffed with straw for insulation. Indoor boots made of felt or padded leather helped retain warmth on stone floors. And still, it wasn't enough, so they kept adding. Fur was the luxury of the cold months. Not only a sign of wealth, it was a genuine defense against bitter temperatures. Squirrel, marten, fox, beaver, ermine, each had its place. Fur-lined cloaks and hoods were coveted by nobles. Poorer folk might line their garments with sheepskin or coarse hair instead. Fur-trimmed sleeves became popular, not just for their look, but because wrists and hands were among the first parts of the body to go numb. Hats and hoods were nearly always worn indoors during winter. A linen coif or woolen cap kept in the heat that escaped through the scalp. Nightcaps were worn to bed. Even beards served a purpose: insulation for the face. Children were often wrapped in cloaks or bound with extra cloth to keep them warm, like walking bundles of wool and hope. Clothing was not merely worn, it was lived in. Taken off only for bathing or for laundering, which happened perhaps once a month. Most people slept in some or all of their clothes, particularly those without access to a heated bedchamber. Even noblemen often kept their undertunics and hose on through the night, slipping off only boots and cloaks. The idea of being undressed was foreign to most during winter. Comfort was survival, not exposure. Layering followed logic. The innermost layers were meant to be light and breathable, easily laundered. The middle layers provided insulation. The outermost were for protection, from wind, snow, and the chill of cold stone. Cloaks were worn indoors not as fashion but as mobile shelter. Children and adults alike would huddle in shared cloaks during meals or wrap them around their legs while seated. In the servant classes, clothing was rougher and simpler, but the need for warmth was no less. A servant might wear a single linen shirt under 2 or 3 woolen tunics. Women in service added aprons and shawls. Gloves were stitched from scraps. When extra clothing was unavailable, servants stuffed their tunics with straw or cloth for padding. Even armor adapted. Knights and guards wore padded gambesons, thick quilted jackets that served not only as protection in battle, but as surprising insulation against the cold. Chainmail offered no warmth, but the heavy cloth beneath it trapped heat close to the body. In bitter months, sentries were issued cloaks and fur-lined gloves to stand watch, and even then many lost fingers to frostbite. Inside the castle, fires burned, yes, but only in specific places. Heat was localized. The kitchen was warm. The great hall, if the fire roared, might be tolerable. But private chambers, stairwells, storage rooms, chapels, corridors, all were cold, shadowed, and unheated. One moved through these spaces like a traveler through the wilderness, bundled tight, mouth steaming, breath visible in the dark. Fashion bent to practicality. Bright colors faded in winter. Heavier dyes were needed for thicker cloth. The best colors, indigo, crimson, forest green, were reserved for the wealthy. Everyone else wore browns, grays, undyed wool. The poor resembled the landscape, frozen, faded, enduring. Wool hats were pulled low, mittens hung on cords from tunics. Cloaks were clasped at the throat and never taken off. A castle in winter sounded like the rustle of fabric, the scrape of boots on stone, the cough of cold breath, the whisper of hoods against hair. And there was etiquette in all this clothing. To remove your cloak indoors was to show comfort or disrespect. To keep it on, humility. In court, heavy clothing was worn even during feasts, both to display wealth and to stay warm. Servants knew how to adjust cloaks without interrupting conversation. Nobles learned how to eat in gloves. Perhaps nothing reveals the importance of indoor dress more than the way people reacted to a rare warm day. Cloaks were thrown back, hoods pulled down, smiles broke out. Faces lifted to sun. A castle came alive, shedding layers like a molting animal. But these days were rare, and until then, the layers stayed on. In the next part, we descend into the bustling, sweating center of warmth itself, the medieval kitchen, where fire was always burning and not just to feed the hungry. Every medieval castle had a kitchen, and in winter, it was more than just a place for food, it was the engine room of warmth. It hissed and crackled with fire, pulsed with the sweat of laborers, and filled the air with a warmth that reached farther than any hearth in the grand hall. While other rooms froze, the kitchen simmered, a small kingdom where heat was born and never quite died. These kitchens were not quaint or cozy. They were industrial in scale and purpose. Think towering chimneys, blackened beams, flagstone floors slick with grease and ash. Smoke curled along ceilings. Steam clung to walls. Soot clung to everything else. Fires burned day and night, not only to cook, but to keep the room alive, because in many castles, the kitchen fire was never extinguished. It was the closest thing to a furnace the Middle Ages could manage. The fire itself was massive, sometimes one central hearth, sometimes several, depending on the size of the household. In the kitchens of great castles like Windsor or Chateau de Vincennes, the hearths were as wide as wagons. Logs the size of men were dragged in daily. They burned hot, sending heat out in waves. Near the flame, the temperature could rival summer. A few feet away, it dropped sharply. Everything happened around this fire. Iron cauldrons hung from hooks. Bread baked in stone ovens, often set into the wall. Meat turned slowly on spits. Stews bubbled for hours. Buckets of water steamed and hissed. But beyond the business of food, warmth radiated outward, not just as comfort, but as a resource. Servants passing through would stop to warm their hands. Cooks rarely needed cloaks. In winter, the kitchen became the heart of the castle, a rare and precious oasis. Those who worked here lived in perpetual sweat, even as snow piled outside. Cooks wore fewer layers than anyone else. They were hardened by the heat, by the endless lifting and stirring, chopping and hauling, but they were also envied. A posting in the kitchen meant survival through the worst months. Heat management was an art. The fires had to be kept hot, but not wild. Coals were banked at night, allowing the heat to smolder gently until morning. Wood had to be dry. Smoke from wet logs could suffocate the room. Air vents and flues were primitive, but essential. Too much smoke, and the fire died. Too little, and the room choked. Some castles employed special firekeepers just to manage this delicate balance. Nearby rooms, pantries, buttery, scullery all benefited from the heat. Walls shared warmth. Doors were often left open. Floors nearest the kitchen thawed first. The warmth was not evenly distributed, but it was persistent. Those who worked nearby lingered longer, and with good reason. Servants would huddle near the hearth after long errands across the freezing courtyards. They'd warm their boots, dry their cloaks, even nap if the head cook was generous. Children assigned to fetch water or wood often ran errands to the kitchen, not just for necessity, but for the reward of 10 warm minutes by the fire. Bread wasn't the only thing toasted. Even the architecture around the kitchen reflected its role as a heat source. It was often located in a corner of the inner bailey, sometimes built as a separate structure to reduce fire risk. But when built into the main complex, its location was strategic, near storerooms, near dining halls, but also near cold corridors that benefited from the accidental warmth. Some castles rooted corridors alongside kitchen walls, letting ambient heat seep into adjacent chambers. Upper floors above kitchens often served as dormitories for junior servants or guards. They were noisy, smoky, and smelled perpetually of broth and meat, but they were warm. Heat was also transferred more deliberately. Iron pots, warmed bricks, or jugs of hot water would be filled in the kitchen and carried elsewhere. A noble's bath, for example, required many such vessels, all heated by kitchen fire. In severe winters, warming pans for beds were filled here, and there are coals drawn from the same blaze that cooked the evening stew. Then there was the food itself, warm, calorie-rich, sustaining. Soups and stews, thick with barley and meat, provided not only nourishment, but inner warmth. Ale and cider were served hot. Spiced wine, known as hippocras or mulled wine, was a winter delicacy, its heat and sweetness cutting through the cold like a knife through ice. Feasting was itself a strategy of warmth. The more bodies gathered, the more candles lit, the more dishes passed, the more warmth accumulated. But at the center of every banquet was the kitchen, a hidden engine churning behind the walls, ensuring the feast stayed warm, and so did its guests. In some castles, special warming rooms, known as calefactories, existed, especially in monasteries, but for most, the kitchen was the calefactory. Its fires were life. During sieges or extreme weather, the kitchen staff bore double burdens, cooking and heating. They became the castle's thermal core, even as their labor went unseen by those dining in distant halls. Of course, there were limits. The kitchen's heat did not reach the towers. The walls above remained cold, and the upper chambers retained their icy breath. Heat was not centralized. It was localized, and fiercely so. Yet its presence shaped the life of the castle in winter. It determined where people walked, where they stood, and how long they lingered. It shaped their routines. Morning prayers came after warming. Letters were written in kitchens or near kitchen-adjacent fires. Old men and women gathered nearby for gossip and heat. Stories were told not in salons, but in the scullery. And every castle had someone who slipped into the kitchen simply to be warm. Not for food, not for orders, but for the fire alone. So we see, amid the boiling pots and crackling spits, the true utility of this room. The medieval kitchen was not only the stomach of the castle, it was its beating, burning heart. In the next chapter, we leave the kitchen-esque glow and descend into the shadows, to the servants' quarters, where warmth was sparse, and ingenuity was survival. There is a chill that seeps into the bones when you reborn to service. not just from the cold stones of a medieval castle, but from the knowledge that your comfort is always an afterthought? The nobility had hearths and furs, the clergy had heated chambers and braziers, but the servants, the ones who cooked the food, cleaned the halls, emptied the chamber pots, they had the cold. Servants' quarters were usually located in the least desirable parts of the castle, low. Damp, drafty rooms near storerooms, kitchens, stables, or tucked beneath stairwells and within the thickness of the walls. These were not places built for comfort. They were built for containment. And in the winter months, they became silent prisons of frost and breath visible in the air. Most of these spaces had no fires. Only the most essential rooms, the great hall, the Lord's bedchamber, the kitchen, were assigned fireplaces or hearths. For the lower servants, heat was something borrowed, from their own bodies, from each other, from whatever scraps they could find. Bedding was basic at best, a straw-stuffed mattress on the floor or on simple wooden slats. Blankets, when available, were made of coarse wool or old, worn linen. Many shared beds out of both necessity and warmth. The practice was common, 2 or even 3 to a mattress, especially among stable hands, scullery maids, and kitchen boys. Bodies pressed together like logs in a fire, trying to outlast the cold. Privacy was not a concern. Modesty was a luxury. Survival came first. Layering of clothing was essential. Servants often went to sleep in the same garments they worked in. Woolen hose, tunics, head coverings, these were never removed, only added to. Even boots might stay on if the night was cold enough. It was not uncommon to find a servant's entire wardrobe worn on their body at once, every garment carrying a layer of warmth and a layer of grime. The idea of changing for bed was ridiculous. So was the notion of a warm bath or heated room. Water froze in basins. Icicles formed indoors. Bedding became damp from breath and never quite dried out. Cold was constant, only movement kept it at bay. Servants employed all manner of makeshift techniques to keep warm. Heated stones or bricks were one. Placed near the kitchen hearth, these stones absorbed heat and were then wrapped in cloth or leather and taken to bed. Their warmth would last only an hour or two, but in that time, fingers thawed and joints loosened. Sometimes flat irons or metal plates were used similarly, though these risked burns if not handled carefully. Another method was using straw, not just in bedding, but in clothing. Servants might stuff straw between layers of tunics or even wrap it around their legs beneath hose. Crude, itchy, and highly flammable, but it provided precious insulation. Some servants took turns lingering near the kitchen or great hall fires after hours, pretending to clean or finish chores. Others simply loitered in passageways where warm air escaped through cracks in doors or chimneys. A few even slept in pantries or sculleries adjacent to the kitchen, knowing full well the risk of punishment if caught. Warmth was worth it. The castle's hierarchy extended even to cold. Higher-ranked servants, chamberlains, stewards, tutors might have private rooms with small fireplaces or share rooms near warmer parts of the castle. These individuals had access to better bedding, warmer clothing, and perhaps even a personal brazier, a small metal pan for holding hot coals. These braziers were portable and could offer some comfort through the night, though they came with the ever-present danger of fire or suffocation. But for the lower ranks, nothing of the sort was available. Laundry maids, grooms, scullery workers, and messengers slept in rooms that barely deserved the name. The castle walls might be 4 feet thick, but that did nothing to stop the cold from creeping in like mist. And yet, the servants endured. They always did. Morning came early, and so did the cold. Waking meant peeling oneself from a frozen blanket, pulling on stiffer clothes, and immediately moving. There was no lounging. The body had to move, sweeping, hauling water, starting fires, prepping food. To stay still was to invite the cold back in. Work was warmth. Sometimes the only real warmth they knew came from the animals. In the stables and barns, often attached or near the castle, beasts generated heat of their own. A lucky servant might be posted overnight in the stables, sleeping in the hayloft above horses and oxen. The smell was awful, but the warmth was real. In winter, that mattered more than anything. Fires were too precious to be wasted on servants. Wood was stored and rationed. The great hall fire came first. The kitchen fires came second. Everything else, if permitted, had to be earned. On rare occasions, a kind mistress or lenient steward might allow a small brazier in the servants' dormitory, usually only in the dead of winter, or during illness. Even then, it was watched carefully, and then there was illness. Winter was cruel in these quarters. Frostbite, chilblains, and fevers came swiftly. There were no medicines, no treatments beyond warm broth and hope. A servant too sick to work might simply be left in their bed, wrapped in every blanket and cloak they owned, waiting for the fever to pass, or not. And even then, the fire would not be lit. In some castles, charity extended no further than the Lord's comfort. In others, a noble family might distribute cloaks or blankets before winter, often to curry favor with God. But most servants depended on each other. Warmth through companionship, survival through shared labor. Comfort through silent gestures, a shared blanket, a hot stone, an extra pair of socks passed under a table. It was in these frigid quarters that the unspoken resilience of the medieval servant was forged. They were the invisible hands that kept the castle running, and often they did so while shivering. The nobles dined in warmth. The priest prayed by the brazier, but the servant, cloaked in borrowed wool, sleeping on straw, curled beside a heated stone, was the true survivor of the medieval winter. In the next part, we'll rise from these cold quarters and step into a place of reverence, silence and stone, the castle's chapel, where prayers echoed against freezing walls. And faith alone was not enough to keep warm. If there was one place in a medieval castle where warmth was furthest from reach, it was the chapel. Sacred, solemn, and built of thick, unyielding stone, the castle chapel was a place for prayers, not comfort, and in the heart of winter it was the coldest sanctuary of all. Chapel walls were often the oldest and most massive in the castle. They stood apart from daily life, built high and narrow, their windows arched and filled with colored glass that filtered in light but kept out the sun's heat. The very design, pointed ceilings, open spaces, and little ventilation trapped the cold and echoed with it. Entering a chapel in winter was like stepping into a frozen tomb, where even breath lingered in clouds and candles sputtered under the draught. It was a place where the faithful gathered in cloaks and furs, where nobles clutched prayer books with trembling hands and monks muttered psalms through chattering teeth. And yet they came daily, without fail, for prayer was as necessary as bread. The freezing air was no excuse. There were rarely fires here. Heating the chapel was considered, if not sacrilegious, then at least inappropriate. Fire was for kitchens and halls, for the warmth of the body. The chapel was a place for the soul. Some bishops and priests believed that enduring the cold was a form of penance, that suffering in silence beneath the gaze of saints brought one closer to God. Warmth would only distract. In monasteries, the situation was similar. Monks prayed in unheated churches well before sunrise, their chants rising like smoke into the icy rafters. The stone beneath their knees was often frozen. During long services, they stood or knelt for hours. Only the thick wool of their habits and their sheer discipline shielded them from the frost. In castles, where the chapel was part of the private domain, there might be minor concessions. A small brazier could be placed near the altar or a candle left burning longer than usual, but this warmth barely touched the space. It flickered at the edges, unable to compete with the deep-set cold of stone floors and vaulted ceilings. Still, faith persisted. It is a strange irony that the place most concerned with the warmth of the soul was the coldest to the body. In the chapel, people drew together not for comfort, but for belief. They huddled on pews, their breath visible in the dim morning light, their boots lined with straw, their gloves stiff with cold. And they sang, slowly, reverently, hymns that echoed through frost-covered arches. Below the chapel, in many castles, lay the crypt. Here, cold was not merely seasonal, it was eternal. The crypt was the resting place of ancestors, nobles, and knights. Carved into the earth or embedded in the castle's foundations, it was a place of silence, of stillness, and of stone. No light reached here but the flicker of torch or candle. No heat came from above. The air was dry, unmoving, and carried the scent of dust and stone. In the crypt, temperature remained constant. Even in summer it was cool, but in winter it was like standing inside the breath of the grave. And yet, even this space served a purpose in the rhythms of castle life. Processions wound down into its depths. Priests muttered masses for the dead. Torches sputtered in iron brackets while the faithful whispered prayers for their departed kin. There was no effort to warm the crypt. To do so would be to disrupt its nature. It was meant to be cold, not just physically, but symbolically. It reminded those who entered of mortality, of judgment, of what waited beyond the life of warm meals and roaring hearths. In winter, its message was sharpened. Death was never far, and warmth was not eternal. Yet despite the chill, both chapel and crypt were woven into daily castle life. Nobles attended mass, children were baptized. Soldiers prayed before campaigns, lords buried their wives. Every step into these spaces was a confrontation with cold, both the literal chill of stone and the spiritual austerity of medieval faith. But people adapted, even here. Candles were brought in bundles to provide some heat. Cloaks were worn in layers. Stone benches were draped with sheepskin. The very act of kneeling was shortened in colder months. And those leading the services, priests, chaplains, monks, learned to speak faster, to chant briskly, to compress ceremony where they could. The location of chapels also influenced their temperature. A chapel built into the keep, near the center of the castle, might share some residual warmth from other rooms. But many were built outward, near the outer walls or as part of a small adjoining structure. Their stone was exposed on three sides. The wind found its way through the joints. Snow sometimes drifted in through poorly sealed windows. One might wonder why such an essential space was built with so little regard for comfort. But in the medieval mind, suffering and faith were not enemies. To suffer cold was to share in the hardship of saints. To pray with numb hands was to prove devotion. Warmth was for the body, but salvation was for the soul. And the soul, they believed, grew stronger in the cold. So people came, day after day, year after year, in fur-lined hoods and patched cloaks, stomping their feet as they knelt on freezing stones. They came in silence. They came in mourning. They came in hope. They came because even in the coldest part of the castle, warmth was still possible, not through fire or hearth, but through faith and community. In the next chapter, we travel to a place where even faith had little hold, to castles high in the mountains, perched on the edge of the world. There, keeping warm was not just a struggle, it was a triumph against nature itself. To build a castle in the Alps was to declare war on winter itself. Snow fell early, lingered long, and wrapped the mountains in silence and frost. Winds howled through stone towers with the force of wolves, and ice sheathed every surface. Yet still, medieval lords built there, not for comfort, but for power, defense, and control over treacherous mountain passes that carried trade and armies alike. But how, in such punishing cold, did they keep warm? The first and greatest challenge of high-altitude castles was their very location. Altitude meant thinner air and colder temperatures year-round. Snow didn't merely dust the battlements, it buried them. Rain turned quickly to ice. Even the stone itself groaned with the weight of frost. In some cases, castle walls cracked in winter, their mortar weakened by years of freeze and thaw. Roofs sagged under heavy snow, yet warmth had to be found or forged. In these alpine fortresses, fireplaces weren't just features, they were lifelines. Nearly every room had one, from the great hall to the kitchens to the guard chambers. Their design had to account for both function and efficiency. Unlike castles in temperate regions, which might rely on one massive central hearth, alpine castles required multiple smaller hearths throughout the structure. These were often deep set into thick walls, with angled chimneys designed to catch and keep heat. The great hall remained the heart of warmth. Positioned at the castle's core, it was usually built with low ceilings and minimal windows to reduce heat loss. Fires here burned around the clock, fed by constant deliveries of alpine pine, fir, and beechwood hauled in from lower slopes. The smell of pitch and smoke filled the air, mingling with the scent of drying wool and damp cloaks hung near the flames. Fuel was precious. Gathering and storing wood in such inhospitable terrain was a logistical feat. Entire teams of laborers worked year-round to collect, split, and dry timber. In summer, sleds and carts carried logs up steep, narrow paths to the castle. By autumn, these stores had to be ample enough to last through months when the roads became impassable under snow. Some alpine castles had wood-piled stories high in side towers and underfloor vaults, protected from moisture and rot. Fuel rationing was strict. Fires were monitored, stoked carefully, and sometimes extinguished entirely during daylight to save fuel, unless a blizzard raged outside. In such cases, the fires were allowed to roar, becoming the castle's last defense against the storm. Stone alone could not hold heat, so innovation followed necessity. Walls were often double-lined, creating air pockets between stone and interior panels made from wood or wattle and daub. These acted as crude insulation, trapping some warmth inside. Tapestries, always popular in medieval castles, took on added significance here. Hung in thick layers, often made of wool or lined with animal hides. They covered not just walls, but even ceilings and doorways. Every opening was an escape route for heat, and every barrier mattered. Clothing, too, was adapted to the alpine cold. Lords and ladies wore cloaks lined with wolf or bear fur. Gloves were padded with sheepskin. Even servants were granted heavy woolen garments in the winter months, along with thick stockings, scarves, and sometimes leather-soled slippers to keep toes from freezing on icy floors. And when garments weren't enough, hot stones came into play. In alpine castles, a daily routine involved heating stones or bricks in the fire and then transporting them carefully to private rooms, placing them in specially made iron or ceramic containers beneath beds or benches. These stones released their heat slowly, radiating precious warmth through the cold night. Entire families might huddle around a single stone, sharing the glow of its fading heat. Window design was especially crucial. Glass was rare and brittle in mountain cold, prone to cracking or fogging. Many castles opted for wooden shutters, layered on both sides and lined with felt or fur. During the day, they might be opened briefly for air and light, but at night they were locked tight, sealed with waxed cloth to stop drafts. In some castles, parchment soaked in oil was used instead of glass, translucent enough to let in daylight, thick enough to keep out the wind. The castle kitchen, always a vital space, became a hub of survival. It produced not just food, but heat. Fires in the kitchen hearth burned all day, and servants took turns stealing its warmth during cold breaks. In some alpine castles, the kitchen was connected directly to multiple rooms via warm air vents, an early attempt at passive heating. Hot air from the kitchen could be channeled upward into sleeping chambers, reducing the need for separate fires. Another advantage, the animals. Castles in the Alps were often built with stables incorporated into the ground level. Horses, oxen, pigs, and even chickens gave off tremendous body heat. Their combined warmth, when channeled correctly, could be used to heat living quarters above. Floors were sometimes designed to capture and radiate this heat, though the smell was another matter entirely. But even with all these efforts, alpine winters could not be fully defeated. The walls remained cold to the touch, water froze in buckets. Ice crept in through cracks in mortar, and yet castles endured. People adapted. They developed routines, constant movement, layered clothing, warming drinks, shared meals, all designed to stave off the deep, paralyzing chill. Warmth was not a given. It was a strategy fought for every day. Visitors from warmer lands often marveled at these castles, not for their beauty or grandeur, but for the sheer will that built and survived in them. They were monuments not just to power, but to resilience. And when spring finally came, it was like a miracle. Snow melted from battlements, fires were allowed to burn low. Windows were open for the first time in months. The walls exhaled the cold, and the people did too. Yet, in the coldest corners of the alpine castles, in the storage rooms and the deepest cellars, winter never truly left. In the next part, we leave the frozen mountaintops and descend into another cold realm, the moat. Often seen as a castle's first line of defense, it was also a silent stage for winter's cruelest tricks. What happens when water turns to ice and defense becomes danger? The moat was meant to be a fortress's first defense, a watery barrier between the castle and the outside world, designed to frustrate siege engines, hinder ladders, and drown the uninvited. But in winter, water turns to ice. The threat of invasion changed form. The defense became unpredictable. And keeping warm wasn't just about comfort anymore. It was about survival along the very edge of cold and chaos. Most moats in medieval Europe were fed by nearby rivers, springs or artificial channels, and many were not just decorative ditches filled with water, but living systems, flowing, stagnant, or somewhere in between. In warm seasons, they teemed with mud, algae, and frogs. But in the heart of winter, they froze, hard, thick, and deceptively still, and this changed everything. To a castle's inhabitants, a frozen moat was a paradox. It offered a bridge where there should have been a barrier. Enemies could walk where once they'd have drowned. The cold made sieges more possible and more dangerous. As a result, the freezing of a moat became a season of anxiety. Guards patrolled its edges constantly, checking the thickness of the ice. In some castles, fires were lit near critical areas to prevent full freezing, a wasteful but sometimes necessary use of precious wood. Other times, castle defenders would break the ice themselves every morning, using axes and hooks to make it unusable for enemy crossing. It was laborious, cold, and relentless. Every night the ice returned. But beyond military concerns, moats influenced the castle's warmth in more subtle, insidious ways. A frozen moat changed the microclimate around the fortress. It created a basin of ice that radiated cold toward the walls. At night, wind swept across its slick surface, picking up speed and biting through any gaps in the stone. Rooms closest to the moat became impossible to keep warm. Tapestries shivered against the walls, windows frosted from the inside. In some castles, entire wings were abandoned during the coldest months because they sat too close to the frozen water. Guests were moved. Guards rotated shifts faster. Even the dogs preferred to sleep elsewhere. The sound of a moat in winter was eerie. Ice groaned and cracked as temperatures dropped. Expansion and contraction made strange music, pops, moans, sharp reports that echoed off towers. Sometimes people thought the moat was alive or haunted, and perhaps in its own way it was a body of water caught between two seasons, never fully safe, never fully solid. But some turned it to advantage. In places where the moat froze thick and smooth, it was used as a surface for transport. Sleds carried wood across the ice from outer stores to the kitchens. Children, despite the warnings, skated on the surface with scraps of bone or wood tied to their shoes. In one recorded case from a Swiss fortress, messengers on horseback galloped across a frozen moat to deliver news faster than any bridge would have allowed. Still, the risks were constant. If the ice broke under a cart, it swallowed the wood and the warmth for good. If a guard slipped, he might vanish beneath and be found only in spring. Falling through the ice meant not just injury, but frostbite, pneumonia, death. The moat was beautiful and deadly. Some castles tried to engineer their way around it. Engineers built systems to divert moat water during winter. Channels with gates allowed partial drainage, leaving a shallow layer too thin to support weight. Other moats were built with steep stone walls that extended several feet above the waterline. So even when frozen, the ice was unreachable. But these systems were expensive, complex, and prone to failure. And then there were castles that simply accepted the moat's winter transformation and relied on manpower instead. More guards, more firewood, more watchfulness. Interestingly, the moat also affected what happened beneath the castle. Many fortresses had cellars, ice rooms, and food storage areas that extended beneath or beside the moat. In summer, these areas stayed cool and helped preserve meat and dairy. But in winter, the chill became unbearable. The ground froze solid. Barrels cracked. Wine turned to slush. Workers hauling provisions wore double gloves and carried heated stones just to survive an hour's work underground. Some clever stewards learned to use this cold as a benefit. They moved food into the moat-adjacent cellars specifically for long-term freezing. Meat stored there in barrels of brine lasted for months. Snow was packed into chambers to keep milk from souring. Ice cut from the moat's surface was stacked in straw-lined pits to be used later, even into the spring. Thus, the moat, for all its cold and danger, became part of the castle's winter strategy. Not just for defense, but for food, routine, and even rare moments of play. And always, the people adapted. They lined the moat side windows with fur. They slept with their backs to the inner walls. They posted guards in twos so they could take turns warming themselves at makeshift fires. Children were taught never to play near the edge. Mothers hung lanterns at night to keep the darkness from creeping too close. In the end, the moat stood as both protector and tormentor. It offered safety from invaders and danger from within. And when the first thaw of spring arrived, when the ice began to crack and melt, and water flowed again, it was as though the castle had exhaled after months of holding its breath. But warmth was still a long way off. The walls remained cold. The wind still howled. And the deepest cellars stayed icy until long after the snows had melted from the hills. In the next part, we leave the moats and draw inward, into the heart of winter's only true celebration, the gathering of people. Feasts, festivals, firelight, and bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in joy. When stone walls couldn't hold heat, perhaps human company could. The cold was relentless. The stone walls groaned. The hearth struggled. But for a few precious days in the heart of winter, warmth returned not from firewood or architecture, but from laughter, song, and the crush of humanity. This was the season of feasts and festivals, when medieval castles came alive like no other time in the year. Winter, especially around midwinter and the solstice, was more than a chill. It was a darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The days were short, the nights were endless, and despair hovered like frost on the windows. Food was scarce. Travel was dangerous. Illness and death waited in every shadow. But this was precisely why celebration mattered. At the heart of the winter festival was the feast. Castles, no matter how remote or poorly provisioned, prepared for this moment all year. From October onward, animals were slaughtered and salted. Ale was brewed and stored in barrels deep in the cellars. Dried fruit, honey, nuts, and preserved meats were tucked away. The kitchen staff planned days in advance, sometimes weeks, to turn scarcity into abundance, at least for a single glorious night. The great hall transformed. What was by day a cold and smoky gathering place became, for one evening, a riot of warmth. Massive fires blazed in every hearth. The central hearth, often the largest in the castle, was fed constantly oak ash, and hornbeam crackling in defiance of the frozen world beyond the walls. Torches were lit along the walls. Candles, rare and expensive, were brought out and set on iron chandeliers and candelabras. The air shimmered with heat and smoke, thick with the scent of roasted meat and spice. The people, noble and servant alike, gathered in dense numbers. Space was tight. Benches and long tables were set edge to edge. Platters piled high with food were passed down rows of outstretched hands. The proximity itself generated heat. So did the movement, dancing, singing, the stomp of boots on rush-covered floors. It wasn't just celebration, it was a strategy. Bodies warmed bodies. Cloaks were thrown off, gloves removed. For a few hours, fingers and toes could feel again. The minstrels played. Fiddles, lutes, flutes, and voices rose in harmony. Tales were told legends of saints, kings, and winter beasts. Games were played, riddles asked, and laughter echoed from the rafters. The feast wasn't just food, it was a battle against the cold, waged with joy and wine. Even those not invited to the Lord's table had their share. Servants, guards, kitchen hands all received extra rations. A thick stew, a slice of salted pork, warm bread dripping with fat, and sometimes mulled wine spiced with cloves and cinnamon, carried in steaming pitchers that warmed the hands as much as the belly. These celebrations often coincided with religious feasts, Christmas, Epiphany, the feast of St. Stephen, but older traditions lingered. Two pagan echoes that remembered the solstice not as a Christian event, but as the turning of the sun. In some castles, a Yule log was burned, a massive tree trunk kept alight for 12 days, each flame licking back the darkness. In others, holly, ivy, and evergreen boughs were brought inside not for beauty, but for their stubborn refusal to die in the snow. They were symbols of endurance, life in the dead of winter. The feast served another purpose, one more primal. It was a release valve for a population hemmed in by cold, boredom, and fear. In the depths of winter, tempers frayed. People got sick. Children cried. Rats scurried through the larders. Sometimes tension turned to violence. But a feast, no matter how short-lived, reminded everyone of what they were surviving for. It gave the servants something to anticipate, the cooks something to craft, and the lords a moment to display their wealth and power without bloodshed. And the warmth, oh, the warmth. For many, the feast was the only time all year they felt true heat. The fires burned higher, the food was hot. The rooms were full. Blankets were shared, shoulders pressed close, and the walls no longer felt so oppressively cold. Some even slept in the hall after the feast, curled near the embers, unwilling to return to the icy chambers above or below. In some castles, the feast ended with a ritual, the giving of gifts. Woolen mittens, cloaks, bread wrapped in cloth. Even coins if the Lord was generous. It was more than charity, it was practical. Keeping one's people warm wasn't just kindness. It was policy. Cold workers faltered, cold guards failed. A warm servant was a loyal one. Yet the warmth of these feasts was fleeting. By dawn the firewood was gone, the candles guttered out. The tables were cleared, the music stopped. One by one, the revelers returned to their cells and chambers. The cold returned, slow and sure like a tide reclaiming the shore. But it was held off just for a while by the memory of shared heat. And so, castles endured the cold not just with stone and fire, but with people. With gathering, with celebration, winter would last for months more. The winds would rise again. But inside the memory of the feast, inside the hope of the next celebration, there was something warmer than flame. In the next part, we explore an often forgotten yet essential contributor to castle warmth: the animals. From horses to pigs, they didn't just serve for labor and food, they shared their body heat, stabled close to walls and chambers, living insulation for lords and servants alike. The cold crept into everything. It seeped through cracks in the stone, crept beneath doorways, and clung to the breath of every soul in the castle. Fires helped. Blankets, tapestries, feasts, and cloaks each played its role. But sometimes the secret to staying warm in a medieval castle wasn't found in the hearth or hall. It was in the stable. In an age before central heating, humans relied on one of the oldest and most consistent sources of warmth known to them: animals. It wasn't just about fur or milk or meat. It was about heat-radiant, living heat. A full-grown ox produces more than 10,000 BTS of heat per hour simply by existing. A cluster of pigs, huddled together, can warm a chamber better than a single fire. Horses steam in the cold, their breath fogging the air like miniature furnaces, and humans noticed. So they built accordingly. In many medieval castles, stables, barns, and byres were not separate distant buildings, as later romantic paintings would suggest. They were often pressed against or beneath the main keep itself. The reason? Warmth. A stable full of animals generated enormous thermal energy, and that heat, while pungent, was useful. It rose through floors, seeped through stone, and warmed the chambers above. In some cases, the kitchens or servants' quarters were built directly over or next to stables not by coincidence, but by design. This wasn't accidental ingenuity, it was an inheritance. The Romans had perfected the use of animal heat in their villas and insulae. The medieval world, while distant from that era's grandeur, remembered fragments of its engineering. Farmers knew, for instance, that placing a pigsty against the south wall of a cottage meant less frost in the morning. So, in castles where survival and comfort were matters of constant negotiation, the logic was applied upward. A common setup in many Norman and Northern European castles involved tiered arrangements: stables or ox houses on the ground floor, then pantries and kitchens above, and sleeping quarters higher still. While the upper floors had fireplaces and window shutters, the lower levels had warmth that never faltered: manure and muscle. Yes, it smelled. But smell, in medieval times, was not as offensive as cold. People learned to live with it. And besides, winter had its own way of muting the stench, freezing it, dulling it, until the odor became just another part of the season's fabric. In many cases, access to animal warmth was considered a privilege. Stable boys slept in the lofts above the horses, not just to guard them, but to enjoy the heat. Poorer members of the castle staff were often rotated through barn watch duty not as punishment, but as a form of relief from freezing chambers. Lying among hay, wrapped in sheepskins, flanked by gentle beasts, a person could survive the worst of a blizzard. Some castle architects even built passageways from the great hall to the stable block, covered and enclosed so that the warmth from the animals could be siphoned into the main structure. These passages also helped prevent frostbite in servants moving between buildings. They were sometimes lined with straw, swept daily, and padded with rushes to soften the cold echo of footfall. The animals themselves, unwitting and unknowing, became partners in warmth. Cattle were the most reliable radiators. Their thick hides retained heat, and their size made them ideal heat sources. Pigs were perhaps even better. They clustered together, instinctively, and stayed warm even when the air outside dropped below freezing. Chickens, too, offered heat, though their contribution was more modest unless, of course, you slept near the coop. Dogs were ubiquitous throughout castles, not only as guards and hunters, but as foot warmers. It was common for noblemen to sleep with dogs under their blankets, and for children to be wrapped up with terriers or spaniels on winter nights. In some places, dogs were trained specifically to lie beside the elderly and infirm to provide warmth and comfort. Perhaps the most peculiar and intimate use of animal heat came during travel. On long winter journeys, nobles often brought goats or small livestock in carriages, not for food, but for warmth. Huddled together, the body heat of human and animal made the difference between life and death. And let us not forget the horses. War horses and riding steeds were prized for more than battle or ceremony. Their breath, their bodies, their steaming presence in the cold air was profoundly comforting. Castle grooms knew this. On brutal nights, they would lean against the flanks of these animals, listening to the steady rhythms of breath and heartbeat, letting their own bodies thaw in the heat of something alive. Of course, all this warmth came with costs. Ventilation was a constant concern. The warmth of animals also brought moisture, and moisture meant mold and rot. The castle's air needed to circulate, so windows even in winter were cracked open in the upper floors to draw out the damp. Fires had to be watched closely. Sparks near hay could mean disaster, and sanitation was an ever-present challenge. Floors were cleaned with lime, straw was replaced regularly, and thick wooden slats separated livestock from the more refined chambers above. Still, the value outweighed the risk. In the heart of winter, when fuel was low and wind tore across battlements like knives, the animals were a castle's secret fire, unquenchable, uncomplaining, and constant. They were not loved as pets, at least not often. They were not understood as we understand animals now. But they were respected. For more than their milk, their meat, their muscle, for their warmth, for their breath, for the life they carried and the heat they gave simply by being. As the snow fell outside and the firewood dwindled, the castle endured with animals at its base, a living furnace beneath its ancient stones. In the next part, we leave behind the stables and turn to invention, how medieval engineers, masons, and builders began to adapt their structures specifically for warmth, developing ingenious features ahead of their time. Stone is not kind to winter. It holds the cold. It magnifies the draft. It radiates chill from within. And yet, for centuries, stone castles were the heart of noble power in the medieval world. They were fortresses, yes, but they were also homes. And homes, no matter how fortified, demanded warmth. Over time, necessity forced innovation. Across Europe, castle architects began developing subtle, often overlooked features designed not to repel armies but to retain heat. Let us walk through these innovations, from grand engineering to simple but brilliant tweaks. First, the layered structure of a castle. While a peasant's hut was built low to the ground and vulnerable to frost, castles rose in layers. Below, storerooms, cellars, and often stables. In the middle, kitchens, chapels, and halls. At the top, private chambers. This vertical layout wasn't just for defense. Heat rises. Placing key living spaces above warm activities, especially kitchens and livestock, meant the upper rooms absorbed residual warmth. Builders learned to exploit this. In many keeps, the solar or private upper chamber was deliberately placed above the kitchen. The thick stone floors conducted heat upward. In some rare cases, clay or sand layers were inserted between the kitchen ceiling and solar floor, trapping heat and releasing it slowly, like a primitive thermal battery. Then there were fireplaces, a seemingly obvious solution, but their design evolved considerably. Early castles relied on central hearths. These were large, open fires set in the middle of a room with no chimney. Smoke rose, filtered through holes in the roof or gaps in the eaves. The results were choking and inefficient, but by the 12th and 13th centuries, masons began building wall fireplaces with chimneys, drawing on knowledge from Roman construction and Islamic architecture. These new fireplaces were transformative. Built into the thickness of the wall, they featured flues that vented smoke upward and outward. The best examples had hooded designs that captured more heat and angled backs to reflect warmth into the room. Some were even double-sided, serving two adjacent rooms at once. These were not just improvements, they were revolutions in comfort. And as fireplaces improved, so did their placement. In older castles, they were sparse one to a hall, perhaps. In newer builds, each private chamber might boast its own. By the late medieval period, even small castles began including fireplaces in guest rooms, solars, and chapels. Next, window design. Windows were a major source of heat loss. In early castles, windows were simply narrow slits, arrow loops, or lancets designed for defense. But as peace settled and comfort became more valued, these widened the problem. Glass was rare and expensive. Most windows had only shutters, often made of thick wooden boards or animal hide. These did little against wind. The solution came in stages. First, windows were deeply recessed, set into thick walls with narrow outer openings and wider interiors. This trapped a small air buffer cooler than the room, but warmer than the outdoors. Some castles fitted internal shutters of heavy oak lined with wool or leather, which could be latched tight at night. Wealthier castles used horn pane sheets of translucent animal horn before actual glass panels began to appear in the 13th century. Later still, builders began using mullioned windows, separating glass sections with stone for stability. The glass wasn't clear, it was greenish, rippled, and cloudy, but it let in light without letting out warmth. Combined with curtains or wall hangings, windows became less of a liability. Another subtle innovation was in the flooring. Stone floors were cold and unforgiving, but castle architects experimented with covering them. Rushes and straw were the common solution, layered thick and often scented with herbs to mask odor. Yet in noble chambers, more elaborate efforts were made. Wooden planks were added above the stone in some cases, creating a warmer walking surface. In a few rare examples, particularly in Norman keeps, underfloor heating or hypocausts were attempted, especially in bathhouses or chapels. These hypocaust systems, adapted from Roman designs, involved channels beneath the floor through which hot air from a furnace could flow. The effect was uneven and hard to maintain, but in monasteries and some high-status castles, it offered a luxury rare in the medieval world, warm feet. Then there's room design itself. Rooms in castles were rarely large unless intended for gatherings. Smaller chambers retained heat better. Ceilings were low in private areas. Doorways were narrow. Tapestries lined walls not just for decoration, but as insulation, sometimes several layers thick. Ceilings might be hung with cloth canopies, especially in bedrooms, forming a heat trap. Some castles even included draft lobbies, small vestibules between exterior doors and the main hall. These functioned like airlocks, limiting the gusts of cold wind every time someone entered or exited. The kitchens themselves were engines of heat, and not just for cooking. Castle kitchens were massive, with multiple ovens, stew pots, and constantly burning fires. Builders positioned them strategically, close to the hall for convenience, but also so their warmth bled into nearby walls and floors. Some castles connected kitchens to the main keep via heated passageways, not to transport food more easily, but to keep servants warm while doing so. Finally, in the most advanced cases, architects began experimenting with heat flow management. In the late medieval period, certain castles featured chimney caps designed to prevent downdrafts and flues that widened gradually to improve draw. Some lords even employed smoke masters, servants responsible for monitoring airflow and ensuring optimal fireplace function. It was an early form of heating maintenance, essential in a world where warmth meant survival. In all these things, the underlying philosophy was the same. Don't fight the cold with brute force. Use design, use planning, use every tool available. Medieval engineers were not modern scientists, but they observed, adapted, and innovated. They learned from Rome, from the Moors, from local builders and ancient traditions, and slowly, over centuries, they transformed the cold, drafty fortress into something just barely livable, just warm enough. Next, we examine what happened when these innovations were no longer enough when castles began to fall out of fashion, replaced by manors and houses that favored warmth and comfort over defense. The castle had served its purpose. For centuries it loomed cold, defiant, unyielding, a symbol of power, a fortress of stone. But by the 15th century, cracks were appearing, not just in the walls, but in its role. As warfare changed, so too did architecture. Gunpowder rendered high walls vulnerable. Central authority began to replace feudal fragmentation. The need to live behind battlements diminished. And with that shift came a new desire, not for defense, but for comfort, especially warmth. Thus, the manor house emerged not as a lesser castle, but as its successor. It marked a quiet revolution in how the wealthy lived, especially in winter. Unlike the stone giants of earlier centuries, manor houses were built to be lived in. Their architecture favored light, warmth, and efficiency over defense. No longer hemmed in by the need for arrow slits and thick keeps, designers could focus on insulation, airflow, and ease of heating. The evolution wasn't immediate, but its signs were clear. First, location. Castles had been built for strategic value atop hills, beside rivers surrounded by moats. Manor houses were built for comfort. They nestled in valleys near woods where fuel was easy to collect. They faced the sun, often with wide south-facing windows that caught daylight and solar warmth. Trees were planted as windbreaks. Water sources were used not as moats, but as convenient plumbing. These were not minor details. They were decisions with direct consequences for winter living. Then, materials. Stone was still used, but no longer so heavily. Brick became increasingly popular, especially in England and parts of France. It was easier to shape, more consistent in its insulating properties, and could be fired locally. Timber framing, combined with wattle and daub, provided excellent insulation. Walls were now built with warmth in mind, not just strength. Roofs, too, changed. Castle roofs were high, steep, and prone to drafts. Manor houses featured lower ceilings, better roof pitches, and thatch or tile that trapped warmth more effectively. Chimneys were now commonplace, not rare. Nearly every room could have its own fireplace, meaning that the house could be heated room by room instead of relying on a single hearth. And what fireplaces they were! Gone were the smoke-choked halls and central fires. In the manor house, fireplaces were ornate, efficient, and strategically placed. Some featured decorative hoods, not just for grandeur, but to improve airflow. Hearths were often flanked by built-in benches, letting people sit in comfort, warmed on both sides. Chimneys were built with internal flues, reducing drafts and increasing draw. And with the rise of iron firebacks, heat was reflected into the room rather than absorbed into the stone. But perhaps the most revolutionary change was in interior layout. Manor houses no longer centered around a massive, cold great hall. Instead, they were divided into private rooms, each capable of being closed off, shuttered, and warmed independently. The great hall still existed, often used for banquets or gatherings, but daily life now occurred in parlors, solar chambers, and private withdrawing rooms. These were smaller, easier to heat, and more comfortable in winter. Windows grew in size and number. Thanks to cheaper glass production, glazed windows became widespread. No longer was warmth lost to open shutters or parchment panes. Instead, leaded glass windows allowed light in and kept the cold out. Curtains and window seats were added not just for reading or embroidery, but because these spaces had become bearable, even cozy. The floors changed too. Instead of bare stone covered with straw, manor houses featured wooden flooring, often with woven rugs or even rush matting that was changed regularly. Ceilings were lined with wooden beams, which not only supported the roof but helped trap heat. The dreaded cold draft became less of a constant and more of a manageable nuisance. Kitchens, always vital, were now integrated into the warmth strategy. In castles, kitchens had been massive, smoky, and slightly detached, necessary for fire risk. But in manor houses, they were brought closer to living areas. Often, the kitchen's residual warmth would heat adjoining service rooms. Warm pantries became common, keeping food and hands from freezing. Even butteries and larders were designed with heat flow in mind. Manor houses also introduced clever forms of passive heating. Thick curtains hung between rooms, drawn at night. Tapestries and wall coverings were used not only for beauty, but to insulate. Some homes even featured internal galleries, corridors that ran through the warm interior rather than exposing inhabitants to outer walls. Staircases were enclosed rather than open, so heat wouldn't escape upward uncontrollably. And don't overlook the personal technologies of warmth that found a renaissance in this setting. Hot water bottles made of metal or stone were warmed in the kitchen and brought to beds at night. Warming pans, filled with coals, were swept between linen sheets before sleep. Woolen drapes surrounded beds, trapping body heat. People wore indoor caps, stockings, and layered gowns, not because fashion demanded it, but because warmth was a constant concern. Even the servants benefited. While castles relegated them to freezing quarters, manor houses often placed servant spaces near the kitchen, or in upper galleries where rising heat made sleep bearable. Chimneys ran through walls between rooms, meaning that the warmth of one fire might warm 3 rooms along its path. In the end, the manor house became more than just a comfortable home. It became the symbol of a new era, a world where safety no longer meant walls 12 feet thick, but rooms warm enough to write letters, raise children, and age in relative peace. A place where heat was managed, not endured. By the late 16th century, the idea of living in a castle was already quaint, even uncomfortable. Nobles still owned them, still used them for ceremony or display. But they slept, dined, and wintered in manor houses or hunting lodges where warmth was predictable and architectural choices supported their comfort. The shift was subtle, but profound, from defense to domesticity, from stone to soul. In our final part, we'll step back from the hearth and ask a broader question. What do these choices, these centuries of innovation, struggle, and stubborn adaptation tell us about the people who lived in castles, about how they experienced cold, about what warmth really meant? Today, when we picture a medieval castle in winter, our minds drift to extremes. Either we imagine the romanticized glow of a roaring fire in a grand hall, tapestries fluttering gently against the stone, or we conjure the shivering agony of cold so deep that even breath turns brittle. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. And the legacy of how medieval castles were kept warm is not just a story of fires and stone, it is a story of endurance, of adaptation, of the human need to make even the harshest places livable. Let's strip away the myths and examine what really lingers. First, the myth of comfort. There is a temptation to believe that with all the hearths, wall hangings, and cleverly placed chambers, castles were reasonably warm, but warmth was relative. Even in the best designed keeps, there were cold spots corners that never lost their chill, drafts that hissed through arrow slits, stone floors that numbed bare feet. People adapted, they layered clothes, they hugged hearths, but they never forgot the cold. This leads to the second myth, that medieval people were constantly miserable. They were not. They were resilient, accustomed to discomfort in ways that modern life has largely erased. Cold was a companion, not a crisis. It shaped routines, when to rise, when to eat, when to work. There were no thermostats, no instant heat. Warmth had to be earned, fire by fire, ember by ember. This shaped their psychology as well as their architecture. The experience of winter was a communal act. People gathered not just for social reasons, but to share body heat, to sit in proximity to the one fire that might be burning. Children, servants, lords, and guests, no matter their rank, shared the same reality. The cold was everywhere. Even intimacy changed with temperature. Marriages were often consummated under heavy blankets with only noses exposed to the air. Births occurred by firelight, mothers swaddled and sweating near a blaze while the rest of the castle froze. Deaths, too, were shaped by winter. Cold delayed decay, prolonged vigils, and deepened the silence of mourning. Still, castles were never just prisons of frost. They were laboratories of human ingenuity. Look closely at the layers of change, at how the hearth evolved, how walls grew tapestries, how window shutters were thickened, lined and latched, and you see a slow, stubborn rebellion against winter. These people refused to yield. They lit candles even when breath fogged the air. They built chimneys tall enough to draw smoke away and flues angled to hold heat in. Even the evolution of clothing tells the story. Wool was everything layered, boiled, felted. Cloaks were fastened with brooch that kept warmth in. Gloves, hats, and stockings were ubiquitous indoors. The nobility wore fur-lined robes, while peasants wrapped themselves in sheepskin and burlap. Cold dictated fashion far more than taste. And there's one more myth to dispel. The castles were meant to last forever. They weren't. The warmth problem was one of the many pressures that made manor houses, palaces, and estates more attractive. These new buildings were built for humans, not sieges. And their legacy is the modern, home-warm rooms, central heating, windows that don't whistle with wind. All of it evolved from that centuries-long battle with cold stone and northern winter. Yet something remains. If you visit a ruined castle today in January, you'll feel it. That deep, aching silence of winter. The wind that moves between the stones like a whisper from another age. The fireplace long gone cold. The chapel empty, the stairwells dark. But imagine it alive. Imagine the fire lit in the great hall. The castle cat curling near the hearth. The cook stirring broth in the warm belly of the kitchen. Children huddled on wool blankets. A lord dictating letters with gloves cut at the fingers. A maid closing the shutters before nightfall. A tapestry lifted gently by rising warmth. The heartbeat of life in a place never meant to be warm, yet warmed nonetheless by effort, by intention, by will. That is the true legacy of medieval warmth. Not perfect comfort, but the pursuit of it. And what remains with us now? The architecture is frozen in time, but the struggle is not. We still fight against the cold. We still huddle near radiators, sip hot drinks, gather close. We light candles not because we need them, but because they comfort us. Our central heating hums, our windows are sealed, our slippers thick, but something primal remains. Maybe that's why we're fascinated by castles in winter, because they remind us of how far we've come and how deeply we still understand what it means to chase warmth in the dark months. From the embers of medieval hearths to the thermostats of our time, it's the same story. Stone, fire, cold, human hands building against it, and always the longing for warmth. End of series.